Good evening. Dear students, I'm thinking of the pleasure that you will derive, I hope, I trust, from reading the verses of Alexander Pope, perhaps for the first time. His wit is so fluent, his humor so delightful, that once tasted, I think you will recognize it as a part of the long line of the turning like a great windmill of the British meter, the iambic pentameter, into unforgettable lines. His are particularly delicious. He was clearly born a wit. I don't think that you can really acquire this. There has to be some imp in your spirit that responds to the possibilities of humor from an early age. And Alexander Pope, was not born into the easiest of childhoods. There were religious wars, as so often in Britain, that caught him and his family on the wrong side. It wasn't comfortable, and above all, he had the misfortune of catching a form of tuberculosis that affects the bone, in his case the spine, and warps it. And it's also stunted his growth. He may never have been intended by nature to be tall, but he wasn't intended by nature but by disease to be 4'8", a very little person, which is what he was. And yet, out of this little person came fulminating some of the most devastating attacks known to the English language on people who he despised and detested. And a great piece of invective is a rather thrilling and at the same time terrifying thing. We think, what God must he have offended to steal in a Promethean way this thunder, this wrath from Zeus, and put it into words. But although you'll find among his writings some of the cruelest things ever spoken, usually about a person disguised, and history has been at pains to rip away this disguise, this mask, and tell us who he is actually talking about. Fortunately, history is doing this all long after the people that Pope attacked have passed from the human scene. They knew who they were. Their friends knew who they were. In the little circle of English intellectuals, everyone knew who they were and who was meant, who was being attacked, who was being praised under a fake name. In the poetic works of countless versifiers, few of them, perhaps none of them, as brilliant as Pope. There's a certain distinction in being attacked by a brilliant swordsman and dissected, as opposed to by some ass with a bludgeon who sets about you. Perhaps perhaps you might relish the stiletto in Pope's hands. So he started off his life with considerable difficulty of health. Like many great writers, I'm thinking of Proust. Proust, I'm thinking of you. Proust was an ailing child. Many a writer has spent sometimes as just as little as a year or less, a few months, in hospital or at home with an illness that would force the sufferer to read books. I used to be published by a firm that was taken over by a company called Reed, and so when you phoned, and if I had occasion to phone my publisher, I would get a London voice on the other end of the phone saying, "Read books," and often I was unable to control myself And I answered, not if you publish them, which made very little sense to the poor girl on the end who was saying, read books 120 times a day, and didn't expect read books. And that was what people needed to know. They had indeed found read books. So I'm talking about childhood illness or illness in youth. You find it very often in people who later become writers. It's as though in that illness they not only had time to read a lot more books than they might otherwise read and gain, if not conscious inspiration to become a writer themselves, certainly literature worming its way into their soul, to their mind, into their imagination. And maybe something more than that. Maybe something about being ill when you're young creates a kind of introspection, a kind of incubation of the self that might become a writing self. It's surprising how many writers have come out the other side of that, crossed that bridge. And Pope clearly did. And from an early age, he tried his hand at poetry. Had a gift, a rhythmic gift, and metrical tricks came easily to him. And so he drew attention from early on, and for most of his life was a well-known figure on the British literary scene. It was hard for him to enjoy his life. He had big prosthetic pieces that put him together. There's a phrase of Ben Jonson, a much earlier poet and playwright, who described a person as being assembled like a great Dutch clock. And you can only imagine what that is. It's these days we would say of Pope that he put himself together like an IKEA table in the morning, and he got out the little proprietary instrument to tighten the screws, and then he was ready for the day. This was not fun. It's not known if he had any amours. He had a long, mean nose in a long, narrow face, which may have been given to delight and laughter, but the many portraits of him obviously don't find him laughing as we would like to see him, really. So he looks like a bit of a miserable old sod, or young sod. And we don't know that he had any amours, that any of his friendships with women were consummated. It's thought likely that they weren't. He had a lifelong friendship with two sisters, the Blunt sisters, B-L-O-U-N-T, which looks like Blount. In English, it's a well-known name that's spoken Blunt. And Martha, the sister who was his great pal, was a lovely lady, and maybe they fiddled around and did some pleasurable things with each other. I would love to think so. He was a great friend, and this is something that is very lovable about him, and it keeps recurring in his life. Those who were friends to him, who were good to him, who were not envious of him, who were not puffed up and inflated beyond their talents, they were lifelong friends, and they include Jonathan Swift, who a gigantic and brilliant talent equal to or greater than Pope's, and Dr. Arbuthnot, who was not just a medical man with a Gladstone bag and turning up and with a stethoscope. He too was a poet and a literary man, and a great friend to my life, says Pope in the wonderful poem that is addressed to him, the epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. Um, and following his the course of his friendships is also a beautiful thing. Wonderful letters are written. If you ever come across, there's a book of 18th century prose, I think it is. I have a copy somewhere, but thanks to lockdown, it's not here. It's in my office, and I've had this copy for more than 50 years. It includes the most exquisite letter written by Pope to Swift, and equally exquisite ones written back by Swift, in which they express the utmost tenderness towards each other, saying, if only we could meet. At this point, Swift is Dean Swift, major figure in the Protestant church in Ireland, his native Ireland. And he got to know Pope well. Pope was in England, and you will see why this is so, because Pope could not travel, was told not to travel, that if he vomited, he would die. And the prospect of getting on a boat to go across the very choppy Irish Sea without vomiting is a bit of a challenge. I can tell you, if you ever get on that boat, you will see a lot of people vomiting. Of course, Pope wouldn't have died, but he believed what he was told, so he couldn't go to Ireland. And these letters lamenting their separate existence, where they say to each other, you are like a limb lost and buried in another country. It's very touching. They write most beautifully. Of course, they're very much aware that they're writing quote-unquote beautiful letters which will be preserved, as they have been, and rightly so, because they're exquisite examples of the English language. So if you come across this, it was a pelican in the old Penguin book sequence, I think, and it contains those divine letters. So poor Pope, he was restricted by the stupidity of doctors, couldn't go anywhere. But when he eventually passed, he had this wonderful description where he says, and I think it's the most moving thing he ever wrote. He wrote, "This long disease, my life." Of course, that could be a metaphysical statement that many a depressed person might want to say. And poor Pope, it was true. His life was, in fact, a long disease. He was able to live in quite a comfortable fashion because of the money that he made out of his translations of Homer, which were immensely successful and are rather beautiful. They belong solemnly and sternly and strictly to the 18th century, and their language as a Homeric language is slightly strange, but they're also elegant and wonderful poetry in themselves. I think other poets have translated Homer in a fashion that brings back the barbarity of those days and those wars a little more powerfully than Pope's elegant and considered verses. But they are still wonderful, and they rightly made him money, and he had a beautiful house close to London in an area called Twickenham, or Twittenham as it was referred to then, and he built his grotto, an extraordinary pre-romantic conceit, the idea of this place with the calming sound of water dripping and stone and under the earth. He was very proud of it, and he showed visitors to his grotto, which still exists, and is you have to get special permission to see it, but you can see bits of the grotto. It's underneath a preschool or a grade school of some kind now on the banks of the Thames. And he died. It's something you read and wonder whether you should follow the idea of it through by imagining it. He died surrounded by his friends. Sometimes, as was the case with my friend Allen Ginsberg, with whom I shared an office at Brooklyn College, the word that he was mortally ill went out around the city, the country, perhaps the world, and people showed up at his house to be present, to pay tribute to his passing. That was a beautiful thing, and much the same was true of an earlier poet, Alexander Pope. His friends were all there. And this is a very nice way to go, and you can all hopefully raise a glass together in your final moments, in your final hours. So what we have of Pope is a deeply sociable and perhaps deeply lovable and loving man who was also capable of some of the most vitriolic passages of writing in the history of the language, to which he's entirely entitled, and I hope you will enjoy him as much as I do and as many people have over the centuries. I wish you well of him. Goodbye, my dears.